Well, good evening. Welcome to Liberty Classical Academy, our Education in Society speaker series. We're so happy to have all of you here tonight. We began this effort a couple of years ago as a way for us to reach out to the community and also to really highlight the things that we value here at Liberty, which is openness to discussion and respectful debate and dialogue on important issues of our day. And so we bring in speakers usually about twice a year, once in the fall and then once again in the wintertime, to speak on issues related to education. And then we open it up to a Q&A session at the end. And so we welcome all of you to be thinking about the questions that you might want to ask at the end. And with no further ado, I'm going to actually introduce our speaker for tonight. Annette Meeks is founder and CEO of the Freedom Foundation of Minnesota, which is an independent nonprofit education and research organization. It develops and actively advocates the principles of individual freedom, personal responsibility, economic freedom, and limited government. Prior to founding the Freedom Foundation, Meeks spent 9 years at the center of the American experiment, first as Director of Government Affairs and Public Programs, and the final 18 months as President and CEO. Meeks' previous experience was in Washington, D.C., where she was appointed by Congressman Newt Gingrich to serve as a Deputy Chief of Staff upon his historic swearing in as the 50th Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. A frequent and popular public speaker throughout the state of Minnesota, Meeks also frequently provides political commentary on local television and radio programs. Please join me in welcoming Annette Meeks.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Can y'all hear me? Excellent. Holler if you can't. I am Annette Meeks, and I'm thrilled to death to be here tonight. You're going to hear some new research tonight, and I'm anxious to get your feedback in the Q&A. So I'll try and keep my remarks very brief, and holler out your questions when you feel so inspired. I work for the Freedom Foundation in Minnesota. It is an honor to sit there and do research on some of the toughest problems facing our state. I usually tell people it's the 3 T's: taxes, transparency, and transportation. And we do those issues because no one else does. And they're pretty tough ones, frankly. We've got some big issues facing our state, but none as important as K-12 education, to be very honest. It is our most important issue. It's what our state spends the largest amount of our budget on, and more importantly, it's our future. Every one of these students represents a really bright future for our state, and that's why every Minnesota parent really cares, and grandparent cares so much about how we educate our children, and frankly, how we educate our children about what. And that's why we have education wars, which is really what I'm going to talk about tonight. It's really kind of an interesting background. Oh, by the way, gratuitous Freedom Foundation commercial here for 30 seconds. At the table, you'll see a report we did about 1.5 years ago. We released this. It is the history of the modern conservative movement in Minnesota, focusing on former Senator Rudy Boschwitz, who really was the founder. It's a fascinating read. It's an easy read. It's got some fun pictures. If you're interested, free copies are right over there. If you give me your card or scribble down your email address and hand it to me, at the end of tonight, I'll sign you up for our free, no spam, email that comes out every 2 weeks. It features just kind of the research we're working on current events happening in the state. And every now and then an editorial comment from me about something that's driving me crazy. It's a nice outlet. Anyway, you're welcome to have that for free. We don't spam you. We don't do anything with it. We don't sell our list to anyone. It's just kind of our conversation. And by the way, I get a lot of feedback every 2 weeks. Feel free to send me a note that way too. End of commercial. Public education is something that we're all part of, and we're all experts at in our own minds because we got one, right? Everybody got a decent education, and we all think we have our preconceived notions about what it is, what it should be, and what it shouldn't be. I come from a long generation, 3 generations of public school teachers in my family. So I kind of was hit over the head at an early age how important our public education system is, and more importantly, what it does and what it doesn't do. My grandmother, I'll talk about quite a bit, but she was quite a character and an early pioneer school teacher. Public schools in the United States came about in about the 1840s in the way we know them today, and they were started as really school districts organized by counties. In states like Minnesota, we really did them county by county and even city by city. We believed in a vast amount of local control. By the time we were done, we had over 3,000 school districts in the state of Minnesota. Right now, in contrast, there's about 328. So that tells you how much consolidation has happened in the last 100 years, and frankly, how small and local the school districts used to be. By the way, when school districts started in the United States, every region of the country did it in a different way. Isn't that interesting? That even in the Northeast, they did them one way. The Southwest did it because they had such large areas without any population. They didn't have towns to organize around, so they tend to organize around regions. And it's interesting because most of those statutes still are in effect in most of those states. How big is public education in Minnesota today? There's, in the U.S., 13,506 school districts around the country. 328 is all we're left with in Minnesota. 168 charter schools started right here 20 years ago in Minnesota. 2,051 public K-12 schools, 472 non-public schools, 843 students in K-12 education today in the state, and about 58,000. Any seniors here? You're one of about 60,000 that will graduate this year. By the way, girls, it's a buyer's market. There's about 20,000 more young men than women will graduate in high school today. Isn't that a nice little statistic? We measure everything in this state. There's 68,213 students in private schools this year, and roughly 4,300 will walk across the stage in May and get their diplomas. Here's the big numbers. In Minnesota, we have 55,277 public school teachers and 61,000 non-licensed, sometimes they call them paraprofessionals, in our public schools. And finally, Minnesota is one of the country's leaders in homeschools. About 18,000 students are homeschooled every day in Minnesota. Boy, you really got to like your kids to have them with you 7 days a week. In the late 1890s, reformers came into the school movement and started to make some changes. By the way, anybody care to guess? Almost every state by 1890 had a state department of education. Anybody care to venture a guess how many people, or as we derisively call them today, bureaucrats, ran the State Department of Education in 1890? Any guesses? 2. There was a state superintendent of education and their secretary. That was it. We ran all of our public schools in almost every state with 2 people. Things have changed quite a bit since then. At the turn of the century, 1890 to 1910, schools suddenly became a little bit more interesting to a lot of people, and a lot of local government and local education reformers came into this new reform movement and how they were going to change public education. And isn't this interesting? Their stated goal was to take education away from politics. They wanted to make it less controversial and more local control. But it's interesting also what they did is quite the opposite, and they also turned it over to what we now have as a very professional education bureaucracy that exists in all 50 states. My grandmother, I told you I was going to talk about my family a lot. My grandmother on my mom's side grew up in rural South Dakota and graduated in 1917 from Springfield Teachers College. She got a job in her hometown as the one-room schoolhouse teacher, and she taught her little heart out. In 1919, my grandfather came back from World War I and proposed to her. It's kind of sweet, actually. They have postcards he wrote back and forth from Europe throughout their whole romance while she was teaching in South Dakota. They announced their wedding, and she got fired that day because teachers were not allowed to be married. When those reforms came about, one of the good reforms was teacher tenure laws. And those teacher tenure laws said that you could be married and you could be a teacher. One of the prohibitions, when you look through the laws, it's actually quite laughable today. One of the teacher tenure laws was men could not have facial hair and teach. I think beards and mustaches are acceptable today. But back then, pretty controversial. And we went through a lot of teachers, by the way, in trying to keep up with all the reformers that were taking over the system. Things went along pretty smoothly until the 1950s. And I always get mad when people say, well, I don't know anything about that. That's why we study history. But I don't know much about this, but I've read quite a bit about it. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik and beat the United States in the space program, apparently that was a very big moment in American education. That parents, social scientists, everyone suddenly stopped, took account and said, we're losing. We're losing to the Soviet Union. They're better educating their kids. They're better educating their kids in math and science. Sound familiar? And they're winning. And suddenly, parents started to get very involved in the school districts. When the parents started to get involved, so did all the special interests. And the special interests really changed things in the 1970s and 80s into what is morphed into the system basically we have today, which is a highly professionalized public education system, and one that we fight over just about every day of our lives. It started with a lot of lawsuits, and a lot of very big lawsuits over, for example, how public schools administered Title IX programs, meaning equality for students in sports. Women's sports prior to the 1970s and 80s were virtually non-existent. And when they were girls' sports, like gymnastics and ice skating and things like that. They were not sports as we think of them today, and certainly nothing like we're seeing today. I'll leave it at that, shall I? It's the decline in the confidence in the U.S. public education system, I cannot stress enough. We suddenly seem to second guess ourselves on every single thing we did in our public education system. Our school boards became very, very political. Prior to that, if you went to any of remember there were 3,000 school districts in the state of Minnesota, the school board members were likely to be some of the most prominent citizens in that community. They were the banker, they were the local shopkeeper, they were people who had children perhaps at one time in the school district, but maybe not anymore, but they were the ones who had a fiduciary responsibility to the taxpayers, because that's the other thing that changed. Back then, almost all of the school district's revenues were from the local property tax. That started to change rather dramatically. Again, many, many lawsuits later and many, many legislative sessions later, we started to equalize formulas. So every school district got roughly the same amount per pupil, and the state would make up the difference. This was a radical change for many school districts that had not benefited. And I have to tell you, I'm reading a book right now about the turn of the last century. So it's about 1907 in rural Virginia. And you read about the separate but equal, that was not separate but equal schools that those young children had. Most of the young African American students didn't even bother. They had to pay for their books. They had just a one-room schoolhouse with less than adequate teachers, and more importantly, out-of-date books, out-of-date textbooks that they had to pay for, and out-of-date materials and teachers that didn't really care. Many of their parents were illiterate and had never had anyone get a public education in the first place, so it just didn't seem all that important. And you can suddenly see how the Jim Crow South ended up perpetuating one of the worst crimes, I believe, that's ever happened in the United States, that children were deprived of an education. And we amused ourselves by saying separate but equal is okay. It wasn't, and it's not. And that's why many of the lawsuits were instigated in the 70s and 80s to make sure those poorer school districts had the same resources that every other district. This also started a huge urge to merge, as former Governor Al Quie called it. We went from 3,000 districts to 300 in a very short period of time. So school districts, especially in greater Minnesota, suddenly became 3, 4, 5 towns that merged into one district. It was very controversial. It remains controversial today. I can still every now and then poke the right buttons in my brother-in-law, talk about his school merger that happened when he was in high school. Still hasn't forgotten about it. He graduated in 1966. It's very, very controversial for these small rural districts. And now that we're down to roughly 300, there's still probably some consolidation that should occur, and yet most likely won't. Congress then stepped into it in 1965 with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and since then has taken an ever-increasing role in public education. Prior to 1965, the federal role in education was, in our state, in Minnesota, less than 5%. It's now one of the driving urges in almost everything that happens in a public school. The 70s are when the lawsuit started. Let me tell you one story. This is mostly for the students here. You guys will like this. Do you have PE every day? Yeah, maybe. Illinois, where I grew up, mandated 4 years of high school physical education for every student. Yeah, that's the right face to make. Amen, sister. It wasn't that we didn't like PE, it's what happened. There was a major lawsuit in the state of Illinois, and we had a girls' gym and a boys' gym. We had separate PE, but it was awesome. We had field hockey, we had archery, we had all kinds, we had golf, we had tennis. Depended upon what season it was, but they took us girls out there and worked our butts off. It was really fun, and it was very fun to have that kind of PE because you had to wear a gym uniform that was a disgrace to humanity. And so at least you were humiliated by girls your same age, and you got some exercise. It was okay. All of that changed with a court decision my senior year in high school, and they mandated by the courts, you can no longer have separate physical education classes, you must all be together, and so you had freshmen and seniors, boys and girls, suddenly thrust into one class. Mine was taught by our high school football coach, who had about as much sensitivity to a group of girls in their gym uniforms. Well, you can only imagine. We had to just revolt and say we will not wear them in front of the boys, and for him to get the point. That was only the beginning of the strife. As a result of the court decision, they had to figure out things that girls and boys could do together that didn't end up with someone going to the ER. When I say that, it happened almost weekly. Somebody would get hit in the head playing dodgeball by a boy who could take one of those little balls and just pelt it. Boom, cracked her contact lens in her eye, she went to the ER. Volleyball was even worse. Volleyball lasted about an hour and a half, and that was it. No more volleyball, no more co-ed volleyball. Girl got spiked in the head with a ball, and she ended up in the ER. By spring semester, my senior year in high school, the only thing that was deemed safe for our co-ed experiment was walking around the track with your best friend. Over and over and over in the oval for 45 minutes. Our coach would always tell us, try not to trip and fall. That was his worst nightmare, is we couldn't even walk. It was an interesting experiment. They've obviously had, dinosaurs roamed the earth when I was in high school and all this happened, but they've had time to figure it out since then. But I look back on it and think that was really a shame, because we had a wonderful physical education program that a court that had never set foot in our high school changed overnight. And that's been what's been happening ever since. The court has also been joined by, I would argue, the most powerful union in the entire country, and that is Education Minnesota. Here in Minnesota, we only have one, and the National Education Association and the, just forgot the other, there's two teachers' unions, and Randy Weingarten heads up this one, and, I'm sorry? Thank you. And they have become, by virtue of money, the most powerful and influential group in public education today. This all came about in 1976, by the way, by former president, at that time candidate, Jimmy Carter, who, up until that time, believe it or not, Education Minnesota, or National Education Association did not even endorse candidates for public office. Doesn't that seem quite amazing? And in 1976, they approached candidate Jimmy Carter and said, we will endorse you for president and send notices to all of our public school teachers and employees that you're the right candidate if you will create a U.S. Department of Education. Isn't that interesting? That prior to 1976, we didn't even have a big building in Washington dedicated to education. It was part of HEW, which was the Health, Education, and Welfare Administration, and which was created by Lyndon Johnson. So it hasn't been that long. And suddenly, Jimmy Carter said, you got a deal. If you'll endorse me, I'll create it. It took him 3 years after he was elected president to get that legislation through Congress. If you can believe this, the starkest opposition was not from conservative Republicans, but from liberal Democrats. I'm not sure many of you will remember Congresswoman Patsy Schroeder from Colorado. She ran for president very briefly about 20 years ago. She was adamantly opposed to a U.S. Department of Education for one reason, and she was absolutely right. She said, if you do this, they will stop sending money without control back to the states. And that's exactly what happened. A giant bureaucracy was created out in Washington, D.C. with the signature of a pen, with the approval of Congress, I might add, that has been virtually unstoppable in their grab for power since that time. The NEA today takes in about, by the way, the whole public education system is about $600 billion now annually. To give you some idea of how right Congresswoman Schroeder was, $600 billion. The NEA, of course, has several million public school employees that they forcibly require to pay dues. In 2016, they spent $2.7 million on just lobbying, and in 2015, $2.5 million lobbying. Their dues last year totaled $27 million. And here's your fun fact of the night. In independent expenditures, meaning expenditures they just do not to elect you to Congress, but just to say, we're opposed to Bob, he's a bad candidate. You've all seen those ads, right? For Democrats, they spent nearly $2 million. This is last 2016. Against Democrats, $0. For Republicans, remember they spent $2 million. For Democrats, for Republicans, $268. I think that might be a mistake. I don't know how you can spend $268. Against Republicans, $3.7 million. The NEA continues to dominate all that we hear about public education because, frankly, no one else has that kind of manpower and money to compete. But let me be very blunt and say, and Jimmy Carter acknowledged this when he hesitantly received their endorsement in 1976. The NEA's agenda is not every parent's agenda, and that's where we have the wars that have escalated in the last 30 years. Their agenda is very narrow, and it's very focused on what's best for teachers, paraprofessionals, and others that work in their schools. It is not necessarily what is best for each student in that classroom. That's why we've seen charter schools explode in their growth. That's why we've seen parochial and private schools like this wonderful place literally appear in the last 20 years. That's why we've seen the homeschooling movement literally explode in the last 20 years. Most of these things weren't necessary 25 years ago. There was just a very small public or private school system, and I'm going to touch on something very controversial only because it's going to lead into the next thing. Anybody here Catholic? I'm not. All right. I'm going to talk to you in particular. At the turn of the last century, there was a very strong anti-Catholic bias in this country. There were many, many people who thought the Catholics came to this country, and they were German Catholics predominantly in states like Minnesota, and they came here to drink and celebrate, and they called them papists and other forms of derision. It's how Prohibition came about, for example. That was really a rebellion against the drunken Catholics in states like Minnesota. There was a congressman by the name of John Blaine, and John Blaine was ferociously anti-Catholic. John Blaine tried to introduce a constitutional amendment, it was almost successful, that would prohibit any money, any federal money, going to any parochial school in the United States. He passed it through the House of Representatives with flying colors. He narrowly lost in the U.S. Senate by 4 votes. Not to be stopped. Bigots oftentimes aren't stopped very easily. He took his crusade to the states and got states, 40 states. And remember, there weren't 50 states back then. He got 40 of them to put it in their state constitution. Minnesota's one of them. This is one of those legacy things that must be changed in this state. It is ferociously bigoted. It was put in there for all the wrong reasons, but more importantly, it prohibits schools like Liberty and others that have nothing to do with the Catholic faith at all. It has nothing to do with the promotion of a state religion, which is what he claimed. It has nothing to do with any of those issues. It was just one man's crusade against a specific religion, that these remain in our Constitution, and I think that's a blot against our state. We're 38 states. 2 states have gotten rid of it. Florida most recently took a swipe at it and failed. They came very close. But it's something that we need to do, and I will tell you, within the next 10 years, that will be my mission. We must get rid of things like this in our state constitution that are blatantly discriminatory, but most importantly, they impede public education. End of that commercial. And the school boards have been the other ones that have really suffered in the last 20 years. While there's more and more power sent to Washington and the unions, school boards have been diminished to really, they quietly negotiate every 2 years the public labor contracts that they have, but the state and the federal government put more and more mandates on them, forcing them to do things that their local community likely wouldn't do, if not with the gun to their head, forcing them for the federal money. This is how big it's gotten with our school boards. There's an election coming up next week in LA County, and I realize LA, we call it La La Land and everything else, but it is a different place. There are 3 school board seats. 1 is open. The other 2, the incumbents are running. $1 million by next week will have been spent on that school board election in Los Angeles County. And that's just the runoff. They still have to go until May when they have their regular election. I can't imagine anybody wanting a job so badly that you would persevere and raise and spend $1 million for a job that pays a pittance and frankly is pretty tough. If you've ever been on a school board or known anybody who's served, there's a reason why they call it public service. 1 million. So what does all this mean? Well, it means the end is near for our current system. I believe in disruptive technology that comes along every now and then, and we're seeing that with the advent of charter schools, with private schools that have propped up out of nowhere because one person has a vision to say, we can do it differently, and we can do it better. And that's the disruption that's happening in public education for the last 20 years that has caused almost like a volcano-like interruption, if you will, of the status quo. It cannot sustain itself in its current way. It just cannot. And so you start to see things like 27 states have now become right to work. What does that mean for public education? It means that the majority of teachers now are free. They don't have to belong to a union as a condition of employment, and they are taking advantage of that. Even more disruptive is what happened in our neighboring state in Wisconsin. 3 years ago, Governor Scott Walker introduced Act 10. Act 10 empowers every single teacher in that state to recertify if they wish to belong to a union and to pick what union they want to belong to represent them in collective bargaining. Every year they have that right to vote. Isn't that wonderful? And it says to those teachers, we value you so much that the step-in lanes that we have, that every non-right-to-work state has for our public education system, that says by virtue of longevity, here's how much money you make. By virtue of education, here's additional how much money you make. In Act 10, it says to the school district, I think you're a terrific teacher, and we need a physics teacher. I'm going to outbid your current school district by $20,000 to entice you to move to Morris, Minnesota. And that teacher's free to do so. It has gotten an explosion of highly qualified teachers to come into Wisconsin and take these job offers that are once-in-a-lifetime offers for teachers, but more importantly, test scores have risen. Isn't that amazing? The market works. And it's happening all over the state of Wisconsin. But more importantly, and again, this is my public school background, you know what's most important about what's happened to the teachers there? Almost every single teacher, almost every single effective teacher has gotten a pay raise. Isn't that how it should be? That we have teachers producing results in school children and that they can pay themselves more. More and more parents in Minnesota vote with their feet every single year with open enrollment. We were the first state to have open enrollment. We're the first state to have charter schools. You start to see these things churn and you realize change is coming, and it's coming so fast and so powerful. I believe that, and I'll make my only prediction of the night, within 5 years, these children, every single one of them, will be eligible for a scholarship to attend this fine school. It's happening. It's happening in other states. It's going to happen here. It has to happen. We cannot stop and stem the tide of the innovation that's happening. But more importantly, why would we want to? Why would we want to prohibit any child from getting the best education for that child or for that family? And that's the kind of innovation that's happening in other states, and it's going to happen here. So those tuition scholarships, they're coming. Blaine Amendment is going to be gone. I'm a pretty stubborn old woman, and I believe that when you have something like that staring you in the face, you got to take it on. Act 10 in Wisconsin, I will guarantee you we will see other states start to emulate what Governor Walker has done, only because it's been so successful. Teacher tenure reform, happening already. Might even happen in this year or next year in the legislative session. How many people think you should keep your job after 3 years on the job for the rest of your life? I don't know anybody who has a job like that except my friends who are public school teachers. But I'll tell you, they will be the first to tell you, I wish I were in a better district because now I'm stuck. Because when you leave that district where you have tenure in, you have to start again, and it takes another year to get that tenure built up, and you're not guaranteed it. So they tend to stay in those school districts versus, be nice to be able to move around. My husband got a job offer in Maple Grove, and we can't move. It's too far for me to commute every day. Teachers get it. These are smart people. They want the reform too. And you know what else? If you take a group of teachers and put them in a focus group, they'll also tell you, I don't want to be here with a bad teacher. I want to be in a school with superior teachers. And that's what this school can guarantee you. Our public schools, unfortunately, cannot today, and they should be able to. And last but not least, after teacher, we're going to see a resurgence in local control. More and more schools are popping up like charters, like private parochial schools, because parents want control. Parents no longer want to get caught up in this public school fight that's been going on for 30 years. They want to be able to say, you know what, I'm going to pick the school that's best for my kids, and what may be great for my oldest might not be best for my youngest. I have a friend who has 5 children. 3 of them went to different schools, and she homeschooled number 4. It's just what was best for her family. And that's how we make decisions, from everything from consumer electronics, frankly, to what cable system, if any, you subscribe to. We've become so individualistic, and we are so used to everything catering to our needs, as it should be. Public education shouldn't be any different. Public education, frankly, should be the leader in what is best for the child. And I think we're going to start to see that flip-flop here in the next 5 years in Minnesota, and certainly we're going to see some dramatic changes in Washington as well. And with that, I'd be happy to take your questions.